Hi everyone, I'm Zaid. I'll be presenting our paper One Label, 1 Billion Faces today. Our paper is fundamentally about the way racial categories are used for faces in computer vision. So, why do we care about face-related algorithmic bias? There are two main applications where bias shows up. The first is face recognition, the second is synthesis. Face recognition models have been plagued with bias problems. Those problems are typically disparity in accuracy across protected groups. Disparity in accuracy leads to misidentification. That doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but it is. Face recognition is now incredibly commonplace and considered reliable. Face recognition systems often reach human level accuracy and are trusted. The NSA uses it for national security. It's easy to imagine how misclassifications in this context can be particularly harmful. Face recognition systems are also used by law enforcement. Amazon aggressively markets their recognition system to law enforcement. The system initially had serious problems, mistaking darker skinned women for men 30% of the time. This is only the most egregious example. When face recognition systems are deployed at scale, small iniquities can result in significant problems over time. I do believe that Amazon recognition has improved their performance recently. But maybe you aren't worried about law enforcement because there isn't a heavy police presence in the area. You still can't escape. Face recognition systems are now commonplace in cultural and sporting events like concerts and basketball games. Even if someone escapes algorithmic bias in the context of law enforcement, it can still affect them on a night out. But face recognition systems are only the tip of the iceberg. Generative models are becoming increasingly important culturally. Everyone has heard of deepfakes. A super resolution model called Pulse was the center of a controversy recently. It upscaled low resolution pictures of non white individuals into high res faces that looked white. But you might say that Pulse is only one model, and super resolution hasn't infiltrated every corner of our lives like face recognition has. But generative models are becoming more and more important. They're being used for storytelling and generating models. In the future, much of the content we consume may be generated. We'd like it to be free of bias. So, in summary, face recognition is everywhere. It has demonstrated bias. Generative models have biases too and are becoming more commonplace. Finally, faces are important. They are the focal point of human communications. Intelligent agents will need to have a good understanding of faces. It's critical that AI understanding of faces is fair in some sense. But how do we define fairness? I'll quickly cover two common techniques. The first one is group fairness, which is depicted on this slide. We wish to equalize a metric, for example, face recognition accuracy across groups of interest. These groups can be age groups, genders, racial categories, etc. The second technique is demographic parity. One instance we want to use it is in datasets for generative models, where there's no obvious metric to equalize. We might notice that a dataset contains very few women or people of X racial group. We attempt to correct it by adding more instances of the underrepresented category. So fairness is somewhat sensitive to the construction of groups you're being fair to. In practice, we often select racial categories as groups of interest for fairness. It's easy to understand why people are treated differently based on what race they're perceived to be. Those inequalities are reproduced by algorithms, so we want to reduce that. But the notion of racial categories should make people think twice. Racial categories have a long history of scientific misuse. I want to go over the problems with racial categories from a socio-historical perspective. A commonly used set of racial categories listed on the slide. But how do we decide what racial category somebody belongs to? I'm going to use the Indian/South Asian category for the purposes of illustration, but you can repeat this analysis with any category and come to the same conclusions. We can interpret the racial category Indian literally as the country of India, but this is pretty clearly arbitrary because the borders of India represent the partitioning of a colonial empire on political/religious grounds. A similar situation arises wherever colonial empire fell apart. The borders are often arbitrary and often divide closely related populations while forcing distant populations together. So perhaps we can expand our definition to encompass the whole of the British Indian Empire. But that doesn't help much because the borders of the British Indian Empire are just one of a series in a long history of shifting imperial borders. We can also consider the impact of intermarriage. People who live in close proximity will become similar to each other due to intermarriage. This includes appearance and culture. If we choose any arbitrary line as a cutoff, people living on the other side of the line will be quite similar to the people inside. This makes it hard to justify any particular geographic region as a racial homeland, because we can't keep expanding lines forever, because it will cover the whole Earth. In summary, it's hard, maybe impossible, to come up with a geographic definition of race. What about the combination of physical features and geography? A naive interpretation of racial categories that combines geography and physical features runs into problems. Example, people who live in South Asia with X range of skin colors are a race. That's one definition people might use. Here's an example showing the skin color variation of indigenous people across the world. We can zoom in on the UN-defined region of South Asia. There's a ton of variation in South Asia in terms of skin color on the left. South Asia, like every other large enough region on Earth, has a ton of linguistic and phenotypical diversity. We know that language is highly correlated with ethnicity. So you have a region where people have different skin colors, speak different languages, and likely have different cultures. On what basis are these people in the same racial category? Finally, race doesn't correlate well with genetics, but ethnicity does. In South Asia, again, like every other large region of Earth, is a mosaic of ethnicities. These ethnicities are different genetically, culturally, linguistically, and in terms of appearance. Squishing them all together under one racial category doesn't make much sense. In effect, taking the 1.5 billion population of South Asia under one category is saying that all South Asians must have something in common that allows their visual identification. I find this hard to believe. Here's a visual example. Each of these faces are from an ethnic group indigenous to South Asia. Take a moment to look. Do they all have something in common? It doesn't look like it to me. One might argue that these ethnic groups aren't representative of most Indians, or that they're a minority. Of course, we should still care about minorities. That's the whole point of fairness. But we can refute that argument as well. Here are the populations of the aforementioned ethnic groups. They're very large, oftentimes equivalent to the populations of mid-sized European countries. Groups of interest in the United States are listed below for comparison. These aren't tiny populations. They're pretty large and happen to be in a certain geographic location due to historical circumstances. We can't ignore them because we have some sort of hunch or intuition that it's not what most Indians look like. Sure, you might say, we know that race is imperfect. It's adequate for the US Census and economic, so why do we care about it being possibly inconsistent in computer vision? Because in computer vision, race labels are assigned by human annotators rather than being self-declared, such as in a census. Human annotators then go through the dataset. The scale of computer vision means that datasets need to be automatically collected. We often require hundreds of thousands of examples. These are tedious for a single human to collect. So they're often scraped from the web, automatically collected, and collated into a dataset. And they go through some sort of quality control. Then finally, human annotators take these existing datasets, they go through them, and they assign race labels. Crucially, race is different from ethnicity or other self-declared identity characteristics because race is something that's ascribed to you. You aren't born with a race. You might be born with an ethnicity or culture or speaking a language, but race is something that other people decide you are. So there's a moment of identification, which is each human annotator uses their experience and beliefs to assign each face a racial category. It's easy to understand why this might not work well. After all, is there any reason to expect that people from a nebulously defined and incongruent racial category will look similar? Nevertheless, people generally seem to believe that these categories exist. There are two possible scenarios when it comes to racial categories in computer vision datasets. In the first scenario, racial categories might be very consistent across datasets. We've already seen how difficult it is to construct a racial category. Most people probably are going on a I know it when I see it basis. It seems very likely that if racial categories are consistent across datasets, they'll be reliant on stereotypes. In the second scenario, we expect racial categories to differ significantly across datasets and be inconsistent. This isn't great either. If category X in one dataset is totally different from category X in another dataset, how do we practically certify that an algorithm is fair? We can always get theoretical mathematical guarantees, but we have to construct datasets to assess our systems against real people and groups. So we have reasons to believe that fair computer vision datasets might employ inconsistent categories or rely on stereotypes. But how do we test that? We can't go through the datasets by hand because there are hundreds of thousands of images, and a couple of people looking in the dataset to decide whether these datasets contain stereotypes or inconsistent wouldn't work very well. Her idea was to use a classifier to recover the racial schema for a dataset. The racial schema is the system of unconscious learned rules that the annotators use to assign racial labels to a face. So it's a mapping from facial features to categorical race label. We train one classifier for each dataset. This results in an ensemble of classifiers, each of which has learned the racial rules for that dataset. The ensemble of classifiers can then be asked to rate a face. If the classifiers all output the same category, we know that the face is highly typical. If they all disagree, such a face must be highly atypical. The classifiers can be compared across racial categories provided by the datasets to assess how consistent those categories are. And now the results. There's significant differences in consistency between racial categories. The Black and the Asian categories are the most consistent. The White and the South Asian categories are the least consistent. Across all datasets, there's a big gap between the most consistent category and the least consistent category. However, the racial categories from one dataset do generalize to the other datasets. This suggests that the datasets share a large number of common rules for assigning race to a face, but there are some differences in those rules. Despite differences, those rules define some racial categories much more strictly than others. You can look at the highlighted green column under the generalization category to see that different datasets there's only a small difference in performance when going from one dataset to another dataset, except for one dataset, which is BFW, but dataset has only a small number of identities, so it's easier to understand why. And that leads us to our final result. Who do racial categories represent? To get a visual sense of the problem, I collected a dataset of ethnic groups from different sides of major regions of the world by hand. These images were either self-identified, secondary identification, such as by a news agency, a travel photographer. I collected about 30 pictures per ethnic group, and what you see displayed is the average faces of each of the ethnic groups. On the left are the ethnic groups which were largely excluded by inconsistent perception from the region that they literally belong to. So Sardinians are from Southern Europe, Balochi people tend to be from Western South Asia, Ethiopians are from East Africa, Filipinos are from Southern Southeast Asia. On the other hand, Icelandic people are on the other extreme of Sardinians. They're from Northern Europe. Bengali people are from Eastern South Asia, as opposed to Balochi people who are from Western South Asia. And Gambian people are from West Africa, compared to Ethiopians who are from East Africa. Finally, Koreans are from a relatively northern country in East Asia, compared to Filipinos, who will be from a relatively southern country in East Asia. We expect that people from different regions of the world, from widely separated regions of the world, will look different to each other due to their separation. It's not guaranteed, but it's intuition. We expect that on average, this will be the case. In summary, the common sense notion of racial categories has some serious problems. All racial categories transfer across datasets. This suggests that there's a lot of agreement on who belongs to a racial category. However, some racial categories are much more consistent than others, which makes meaningful comparisons across datasets difficult. Finally, the difficulty of defining racial categories implicitly makes the use of stereotypes necessary for assigning racial categories to faces. However, we've shown that these stereotypes aren't inclusive. They exclude ethnic groups which literally belong to the regions the racial categories ostensibly represent. It seems that datasets agree very strongly on who is consistently perceived. It seems that datasets agree strongly on very consistently perceived racial categories because we've strongly stereotyped those racial categories. So it's not that it's harder to identify, it's easier to identify somebody who is Asian or somebody who is Black compared to somebody who's South Asian or somebody who's white. It's just that people seem to have stronger stereotypes and agree on what those stereotypes are for people who are labeled as Black or Asian than for people who are labeled white or South Asian.